Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Tobey, and I am calling you from NATO HQ. Former debater, current cyber policy nerd, and everything that we're going to talk about today is my opinion, my view. You cannot cut it in a card. I am not representing NATO, and I cannot tell you what all 30 allies, soon to be 32, and what the alliance thinks as a whole, but I can give you my thoughts and opinions on it. So given that, there was just a question about kind of I believe it was like kind of the three most important areas in terms of cybersecurity and US NATO cooperation. So I would say one area that's incredibly important is NATO is a defensive alliance, right? And so we're aimed at protecting our members, is really figuring out a way to defend ourselves and our allies in cyberspace. So that means areas of kind of incident response and cooperation, which was mentioned briefly in the latest strategic concept and Madrid Summit declaration. The second area I would say that is incredibly important is figuring out what deterrence and defense looks like in cyberspace. And that's something doing a lot of thinking of how we structure our exercises, our military structures, how we're incorporating cyber into other ongoing domains, air, land, sea, and space, but how it operates as its own domain. And the last area I would say is critical infrastructure. So really protecting key critical infrastructure sectors. CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency in the United States, has 16 critical infrastructures and several other critical, I believe, functions. And all of those have really strong ties into cybersecurity. Those are seen as kind of the biggest threats in terms of kind of broader public impact, and figuring out ways to really work with private sector, which often owns critical infrastructure, to protect them, get information to increase defense is incredibly important and something that each country nationally is doing, but the alliance is trying to help. One of the ways they're doing that is through the Cyber Defense Pledge, which is a mechanism to help individual nations build up that capacity to protect their critical infrastructure and whole of government work.
So can you tell us a little bit more about cybersecurity as an area to get us started? I mean, we all know that, you need to have a password for your email. We brainstormed some ideas, VPNs, firewalls, things like that in our lecture just a few minutes ago. What does that mean for a professional in the field? What are the things we're not thinking about? And why is two-factor authentication worth the annoyance?
Great questions. So I guess there are two ways to think about cyber, and you'll very often hear people kind of back up and say cyber or cyberspace. So there's that technical level, which you're entirely correct. That means that we're thinking about ways that the internet works and how we rely and use internet. And when it comes to cybersecurity, we're thinking about ways to protect the technical integrity. There's something called a CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability. And essentially every technical thing we care about and do and want to protect can be either needs more availability or more confidentiality. You can't have all three at the same time. You can Google that too. And yeah, it's about securing information and securing access. Putting that aside. The other way we can look at it is through cyber defense. And this is actually a really interesting distinction that I've learned at NATO. For your purposes, cybersecurity and cyber defense are, I would argue, both encompassed in this topic. But cyber defense is really looking from a broader policy perspective, how the operational domain of cyberspace works. So this is where we get into areas of hacktivism. This is where we get into ransomware. This is when we get into Russian sandworm campaigns or Chinese advanced persistent threats, APTs, really targeting US intellectual property, right? So it's that space that I think is really interesting from a policy perspective, because you don't necessarily need to have a lot of technical knowledge. You basically need to understand the way that cyberspace as a domain is different. And I'll tell you what that is right now, which is cyberspace is constantly contested. It's always on, as some people here like to say. And that means that there's no official start and stop like there is in, naval warfare, right? Or naval contestation. Instead, there are little hacks always going on. In the United States, we refer to this concept as persistent engagement or defend forward, another really good Googleable term that everyone should know. And that's really important to understand the framing of cyberspace. And one thing to think about is cyberspace as a military domain is different, but it's different just like every other domain is different, right? So like when we only had soldiers on the ground and we started putting people in the air, we all freaked out because it was like, oh my goodness, the dimensions of this 3D warfare. How does this work? How are airplanes different than soldiers on the ground? Same thing happened on the sea. Same thing is happening in cyber. The big distinction between cyber is not zero gravity. It's not that it's 1,000 feet in the air. It's that it's hard to see. And it's that there is constantly competition below the level of armed conflict and war. And that's the thing that's really difficult to grasp and that policymakers are currently coming to terms with. And so really thinking about the threat landscape and then thinking about the threat actors. So hacktivists, criminals, spies, terrorists, military. Those are your primary actors in cyberspace. And every kind of governmental agency has different interests. So the DOJ, mostly interested in hacktivists and criminals, right? Whereas our Department of Defense, mostly interested in military and terrorism. So thinking about the actors, how they're acting in cyberspace and how cyberspace has a lower barrier to entry. Oh, and I answered the biggest threat question, or broadly, specifically, the question is in terms of cybersecurity, who is the biggest threat? It depends on what you're trying to secure. So David, was that?
Go ahead.
Okay. So when we're talking about things like intellectual property, when we're talking about kind of tit for tat competition, when we're talking about capacity building of ICT, which information, oh, it's escaping me, ICT, information and something technology, it's like IT infrastructure technology, information and communication technology. It's going to be China. When we're talking about disinformation campaigns, when we're talking about ransomware that is weaponized to really have targeted political effects, we're going to be looking more towards Russia. When we're talking about the ability to utilize cryptocurrency and fund nuclear proliferation programs, I wrote a paper on this, that's going to be North Korea. And when we're talking about kind of like general chaos, the barrier to entry is so low. It can be, you could go on the dark web right now and buy ransomware as a service, and you would be able to ransomware, a local mom and pop shop. It's a little bit terrifying how easy it is to be a criminal in this space. Sensors to, okay, so do you think it is better to have sensors that detect the attacks, or is it more important to prevent them? So this is a good question because it gives me the opportunity to highlight something that is kind of fundamental. So the thing that I'm going to say is I remember when I was at camp and you're trying to think of like a really cool affirmative idea, right? Like you're trying to think of a cool AF case. And sometimes you work backwards. You're like, oh, wouldn't this thing be cool, and figure out how to justify it. If you're interested in doing cyber, I would highly recommend taking an hour. And I told David, I have a list of like things you should Google and things you should know, and ways to test that. And I'll send that to you after this. And if you take an hour to do that, and you can even do it like you and your partner, or you and your team, and everyone can split it up and then talk about it, you're going to have a much easier time. So the sensors to detect attacks are based generally off of artificial intelligence that has only learned from past attacks. So it's really useful if you're a mom and pop shop and you maybe aren't big enough to have a really fancy dancy IT setup, right? But you want to make sure that you're not vulnerable to attacks. So that means that if the antivirus system or the sensors essentially are learning as quickly as they can from information that they're getting from other people that have been attacked, that they'll stop attacks that have already happened. But when we're really concerned about, when we're thinking about APTs, advanced persistent threats, these are people that use custom malware, they use custom code that can entirely evade the kind of off-the-shelf stuff that you would get from a general antivirus. So I would say that it's like sensors are good to have, depending on what you're trying to secure and depending on who are you worried about trying to hack you. When it comes to prevention, there isn't really a way to prevent a cyber attacks, kind of like there is, I like using, I very, very briefly interned at the Air Force, and I like using this as an analogy, which is we have air missile defenses, right? Where like if we see a plane coming, a bad plane or a bad, like there's a nuke on it, you ideally can shoot it down, right? So like the Iron Curtain in Israel. We don't really have that in cyber, right? The closest thing we have is antivirus software, but even then that says we are detecting a current attack or there is an attack, there is a virus, and we need to kick it out or we need to tell you it's there. The only way when we think about prevention, I highly recommend not thinking about it on that technical layer, but thinking about it on the governance layer. So the governance layer is where we're thinking about persistent engagement. It's where we're thinking about deterrence and defense. And there we haven't figured out the exact recipe for success, but I think really thinking about ways to model behavior and shape adversarial behavior is really important in this space. There's a lot of debate here. You'll read a lot of stuff. Attribution is impossible in cyberspace, so deterrence is impossible in cyberspace. I think that's baloney, and I could spend a whole hour talking to you about it. But when you're getting to that level, I think that's where it becomes really interesting, the arguments, instead of staying at the technical level of like AI enhanced antivirus software. Second question, what's the role of cybersecurity in protecting democracy, for example, against disinformation and influence campaigns? Great question.
Amanda,
So, yes.
Give you a slight intervention here.
Yes.
Have I shared our core file set with you already?
No.
Well, this is a great question. I definitely want you to answer it first.
Okay.
But some context for you, especially in the cyberspace. We have our novices have a case about protecting elections and democratic institutions from cyber assault.
Okay.
And we also have a case which you mentioned earlier, talking about cryptocurrency, especially in the context of North Korea. And I think we actually quote you in the case. It's fun to become a debater and become the expert, isn't it?
It is.
We also talk about sanctions avoidance and ransomware. So those are the two kind of cybersecurity focused affirmatives we have that you'll get some questions about. But let's definitely get to Noah here.
Cool. One quick follow-up question. You said sanctions. Oh, avoiding sanctions. That's what you meant by avoidance. Okay, cool.
Yeah, like
Noah.
Especially around Russia and the war right now.
Okay, cool. Debaters always flow. And if you don't flow, you should do that. Public service announcement. So Noah, great question. So there are kind of two levels to this. There is the disinformation level, right, and influence campaigns, which you mentioned. And then there is the actually securing the process of voting. So is disinformation a cybersecurity domain? That is debatable. Most people that are interested in cybersecurity and cyber defense also will be well-versed in disinformation in some way. And that is partially because things called botnets, again, I'm gonna flag Googleable terms here. Botnets are often responsible for helping spread disinformation, which then in turn obviously influence campaigns. The other thing is obviously disinformation is often spread online, and there are ways to rework algorithms, put in cybersecurity protections to detect bots, put in safeguards and protections to kind of give warnings and alerts if something looks like mis or disinformation. Also flagging that mis and disinformation are two different things, good to know. And so the role in cybersecurity there is stopping really fast, easy spread of disinformation, and then also flagging disinformation when it comes up. On the kind of level of securing your vote, that comes from basically, I would then say 2 layers there, right? So one layer is making sure people have access to voting information, right, which is often found online. And the second is making sure that electronic voting machines are safe, which so far they have been through several audits that have happened here in the United States. If someone was telling me that like voting machines were in danger, I would need a very high bar for that. Though there are some vulnerabilities, the security protections, the ability to double check, the ability to do hand ballots, again, with all of the additional audits that were done over the past couple of years makes that more difficult. Is what true across all NATO members? That level of security. Oh, okay, so for voting machines. It is true for, I would actually argue it's probably more secure in Europe because of the GDPR. So what the statement I just said about elections and voting machines, very true for the United States. When it comes for Europeans and voting security, they tend to have more secure data because of a law called the GDPR, which is somewhat similar to a California law that is, I believe, the CCPA. I might be missing one letter in there. And I'm not sure specifically about their election security. I would highly suspect it is at that same level. And I know that they do meet the same benchmarks that the United States does generally. And I'm trying to think of the second. Yeah, so they should have all of the safeguards. The GDPR is also really interesting here. I'm not quite sure. This is probably just throwing this out as fodder for David and kind of the teachers. I know this is about like the United States engaging in security cooperation with NATO, but the GDPR does a lot of stuff for security protections that actually mess with cybersecurity. So in the case of Ukraine, this is public knowledge. The GDPR made it so that all countries have to have their data and information localized within a country. And then when Russia attacked them, it meant that all of their information was vulnerable because it was all on physical servers in Ukraine. And so they then had to back up all of their data into the Microsoft cloud. And so essentially their data was protected by Article 5. It's protected by Microsoft, which is a US company, while their country was under war. And that's just a really interesting case there of where cybersecurity is important. An article I would recommend is by my colleague Daniel Black in Foreign Affairs, The Myth of the Missing Cyber War, is also a good way to look at this governance level discussion on cyber. Going to Victoria's question, what is the relationship between the US and NATO in terms of protecting against cyber threats? Cool. So I shared this topic with some of my colleagues and we all had a pause because it's essentially saying that the United States should increase security cooperations with itself in some ways because the United States is one of the 30 allies. And when it comes to the US and NATO, the US is like any ally, an active ally, a voice in 30. However, the United States does have one of, and I would argue the most advanced cybersecurity and cyber defenses in the world. We're a cyber superpower. DARPA founded the internet. And so the United States is, this is the part where I need to be careful, is very good at advocating for advances in cyber defense, is advocating for resilience, and this can be seen in kind of their public statements, and is really interested in building up the resilience of the alliance and being able to create interoperability, so the ability to work with other allies as needed on cyber defenses. How does NATO and the EU interact? Oh, that's a question. My colleague just heard me and she laughed because that's a question. So very recently we had, and again, this is public information, NATO EU staff talks. And so the NATO and EU, a lot of NATO allies are EU members. The United States is one of the few allies that is not a member of the EU. And essentially there is some overlap, but the NATO is supposed to be about the military side of cyber, whereas the EU is supposed to be more about building capacity and incident response. There's a lot of overlap there. And so essentially we try to develop capacity of our members, so of EU members, EU develops EU member capacity, NATO develops NATO member capacity. There's a lot of overlap in those two areas, while trying to not duplicate efforts, because we're aware that there are not enough cybersecurity experts in the world to do that. If there's a more specific question there, I'm happy to answer it, but that is a kind of a sticky topic in general. Okay. At what point does cybersecurity go too far in the name of security, such as preemptive cyber espionage and attacks? And okay, so I'll start with that one. So I would challenge everyone to take a question here and say, what happens if I took cyber out of it, right? So preemptive cyber espionage, AKA espionage, which every country does, right? So can you go too far? I don't know. The means is different, right? So, and then to protect again, or sorry, what was that? And preemptive attacks. And again, what is an attack, right? So if you were to send spies to a foreign country and have them break into a building, would we consider that an attack? Does it become an attack if malware does that instead of a person? And when it comes to preemptive cyber attacks, that gets a little sticky. I'm assuming this person is probably referencing Stuxnet, which is my Stuxnet. I love talking about Stuxnet, to be clear, but I'm going to save that for you unless people have specific questions about it. So I would say it goes too far as you justify it by international law, right? So can you justify a preemptive attack, which from my reading of international law, I'm not a lawyer, but have looked at the cyber aspects of this really thoroughly. I'm particularly reading the Talon manual, which is a hefty book, but you're going to cut great cards from it, I'm sure. I would say it comes to, can you justify that there was an imminent attack and that you took proportional measures in doing a preemptive attack? And proportional, it would both have to be proportional, and then it would not have to be reckless. So for those of you who don't know, Stuxnet basically tried to mitigate an illegal Iranian nuclear facility by blowing up centrifuges. Really, really, really cool case study. The first time ever recorded that a cyber attack led to kinetic real world big boom effects. They weren't that big booms, they just, some machines broke down. And the idea behind this, the US justification was that Stuxnet was attributed to the US and Israel. And the justification was it was a preemptive attack in order to stop Iran harming the US and Israel, right? And the cool thing about this is it was specifically tailored, this malware, so it only affected specific Siemens machines that had something like 88 other machines connected to them that were running on Windows 97 and only operating on certain times of the day. So it was so targeted. And so in that case, right, there are legal justifications there. And part of these new ways of cyber attacks is that you're getting lawyers in the room to basically tell you if it follows certain laws and agreements. How does NATO organize cybersecurity protections? What safety precautions are in place at NATO to protect against cyber attacks? So cannot get too specific there. I can say that we have two parts of NATO. We have cybersecurity and cyber defense. Cybersecurity is making sure our own networks, our NATO networks, are safe and secure from kind of outsiders attacking like HQ or attacking NATO branded things, right? And we use kind of best practices. We have technicians, and we really look to protect ourselves from that. In cyber defense, that's when all of the allies come together as individual nations that are part of the NATO alliance and try to protect themselves and each other from cyber attacks. And that could be sharing best practices. There's something called the MISP, malware information sharing platform. It could be sending alerts and intelligence to each other. It could be helping each other with incident response if there's an attack. It could be tipping people off if something's coming their way. And so that's kind of the two ways that at NATO we conceptualize cyber. How can we prevent attacks in everyday life? Who programs AI technology used by the military? Okay, so it depends on attacks on who. So if you're thinking of yourself, right? If you're just like, oh my goodness, I am just having, you know, in debate where you realize like everything could actually lead to nuclear war. There's a cyber version of that where you realize that if Russia really wanted to try, they could get everything to ever, like everything about me they could try. I could not do anything to defend myself against Russia. If they want to find out information about Amanda Tobey, they can do it in a heartbeat. And so the kind of idea there is you don't want to be the lowest hanging fruit, right? And that's where it comes to, I avoided the MFA question, like the MFA question, multi-factor authentication is worth the hassle because it makes you not the lowest hanging fruit. It means that the person that buys ransomware as a service online is not going to target you, they're going to target someone else. And that's kind of where cybersecurity is right now, is you don't want to be the lowest hanging fruit. And so everyday life would be like, get a password manager, change your passwords, cyber hygiene. If you're talking about everyday life in like DC, Washington policy circles, that would be really asking yourselves like, hey, we want to start a new program. Let's build in cybersecurity from the start. So another really interesting area here is supply chain cybersecurity, right? Like if your vendors are not cyber secure and they're connecting into your system, you're not secure anymore. If your vendors are not secure, they're connecting into your vendor system, that connect into your system, you're no longer secure, right? So that is a way that in everyday life thinking, how are we building cybersecurity into our products, into our practices from the start, instead of trying to tack it on later. And these are defense in depth concepts. Again, another Googleable term. Is cyber escalation something that could happen? So that's really interesting. So in deterrence, in defense, in general military theory, there is the idea of the escalation ladder. Googleable term. And cyber escalation is interesting. There have been a bunch of studies and war games run, and in exercises, people seem to be very hesitant to make the jump from cyber to kinetic conflict. However, it is something that could happen. It's possible. One of the things that NATO very specifically says, as well as the United States, is that we can use all of the tools in our toolbox to respond to a cyber attack. So that means if there's a cyber attack, we don't have to respond in like to a cyber attack. We can respond with sanctions. We can just respond with a strongly worded statement. We can respond in theory with any type of kinetic measure. So yes, cyber escalation could happen, but again, take cyber out of it, like escalation could happen. There are lots of ways to avoid escalation. Let's be smart on how we frame that. It's a common counterplan idea. I don't know what that's referring to.
We were talking about the EU earlier.
EU. Yeah, the EU should do it. So my thought there, okay, that's actually really helpful, more context. Like the EU isn't a military alliance. They're trying, okay, disclaimer, again, I'm gonna say this one more time. I'm Amanda Tobey. I do not talk on behalf of NATO or the EU or Europe or any of these places. But as its foundation, the EU is not a military alliance. It is trying to expand its scope to encompass military practices, but that's not what it's geared for. And one of the things that NATO is good at is because our mission is so tailored, I would argue it makes us particularly effective at things like missions. There's already a NATO military command structure that all of these countries had, NATO allies had to have in order to join NATO and be interoperable. And so it's not a command structure that the EU has. So either EU would replicate that structure and then the work would be duplicative, but why would you pay for duplicative work? Or they would have to create their own command structure that wasn't duplicative, but then would be fragmenting efforts. So I think it depends on what you're counter planning. If it's something to do maybe with data protection, disinformation, regulations, like the GDPR is an interesting concept there. And I would argue that like through that mechanism and the fact that the EU can actually pass laws, which the United States has a difficult time doing nowadays, sure, I could see that as a counterplan argument. But when it comes to like cyber attacks, so like on critical infrastructure, or what we're really worried about in terms of ransomware groups, that would be a pretty high bar for me to understand why EU would be able to do it better than NATO. Did I answer your question? Great. How do we share with allies? Great question. So NATO has an intelligence unit. I actually don't know if, I assume their name is public knowledge, but I'm gonna not share that just in case, but there is an intelligence unit whose job is to collect information that allies voluntarily give NATO and then disseminate it to allies as needed. So that's one mechanism where an allied intelligence agency like the CIA, an allied law enforcement agency like the DOJ, I'm just using the United States now, CISA, could send information to NATO. They all have liaisons with NATO. NATO receives it, processes it, sends it out to allies with the proper classifications involved. That's one way. The second is through something like I mentioned called MISP, the Malware Information Sharing Platform. And that is a smart defense project that essentially allows allies to share information with other allies. And lastly, like we're an alliance of 30, but also they're individual members. So sharing can often happen on multilateral or bilateral bases. So that means the United States might share with another NATO ally without going through NATO, or they might share with another NATO ally and then just kind of loop NATO into the background so that NATO is aware and can share it with the rest of the allies. So here, NATO is just a really easy way to kind of hit like reply all in an email instead of typing in each individual name. When that comes to big government bureaucracies, that reply all is really, really important because cyber information moves so quickly. How did you go about getting a job like this? Is it appointed by administration? Oh, Taylor, hi Taylor, what's up? So how I got this job. Okay, there are kind of 3 tracks. So I'm doing the intern to temp track, and that's just a normal merit competitive process that you can do online. The second is you can apply directly. Oh, and then often temps will then stay on and become full-time employees, but I'm not doing that by choice. The second way is you can apply for a post. And then the third way is there are some more like political appointments. So or I guess there are 2 here. There are political appointments, but there are also like, there's a US delegation inside NATO, like they're right upstairs. And they're really nice. And it's the like one place I can go and I can sit in the lobby and there's an American flag and there's President Biden and everyone has an American accent and sometimes you need that. Through their active military can come in through the Department of Defense. And then there are also people from the Department of State there. And so they're sent there on missions or tours. I'm assuming that was the question. I'm sorry if I misunderstood that and talked about myself for no reason. Sincerest apologies. What are some ways to deter future attacks instead of protection of the escalation? Okay, so there's a theory that you can't have deterrence in cyberspace. Pet peeve. The reason why is because you can't attribute. One, you can attribute in cyberspace. We do it all of the time. All of the time. It's a different attribution process than physically watching someone shoot a gun, but we have really advanced technical means, and there are also ways to think about politically. I don't know, what country do you think would want to cyber attack Ukraine in the middle of Russia and a war there? Right? So attribution is really like a 360 process that we can do. So when it comes to deterrence, it's just about shaping behavior. So when it comes to shaping behavior in cyberspace, we have some go-to things. So we may publicly name and shame and say, this country did this bad thing using this evidence, right? The problem there is we often don't like to share our work because it will reveal some of the tools and techniques and processes we have. And so attribution. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So attribution can be complicated, it's really interesting. Shaping behavior means imposing consequences or denying benefits. So we deny benefits by building resilience. So that's kind of where the NATO Cyber Defense Pledge comes in. That's where organizations like CISA are really important to build robust resilience, meaning that we can get hit with a cyber attack, but we can still function and do whatever the mission is. So I'm an organization, I get hit with a cyber attack, I can still function and do the mission, even if I'm maybe not functioning at 100%. And I can get back to 100% relatively quickly. That is denying them the benefits of an attack. So why would you attack me if it didn't even help, if it didn't do anything for you? And then there's shaping behavior and a denial by punishment, essentially. So if you cyber attack me, there will be retribution. And that goes back to the idea of we have a large toolbox, dime-filled, diplomatic, information, military, economic, financial, intelligence, law enforcement. Dime-filled, another Googleable term. And we can use any one of those tools to respond to a cyber attack. We might use multiple of them, right? So it's whether or not that deterrence is effective, and that is really difficult to see in cyberspace, right? Because I know how many times I've been attacked. I don't know how many times I've stopped an attack, right? So that's kind of this difficulty with deterrence. And it's even harder to see it when it comes to a space that is invisible to us, right? Did they not have the intention to attack this entire time, or did I change their behavior? And so that's why one of the really important things that NATO is trying to do is build up norms and best practices in cyberspace that give a baseline for what good behavior is. So when people veer from the baseline, we can see it. But if they don't, we can maybe reward it. Oh, and then specifically ways to deter future attacks. Persistent engagement is really interesting, and building resilience would be like the two kind of more specific practices. What would the US increasing security and cooperation help cybersecurity? Help cybersecurity is it basically overlap. So I read that, this is something that was kind of what I was thinking when I read the question. I think about that as the United States investing more resources in cybersecurity at NATO. So potentially utilizing, like sending more government, like US government entities or employees to help not just train like NATO, right? Because there's NATO as an HQ, the organization, the command structure, but NATO allies. It might be the United States sponsoring projects that, or sponsoring and or funding and or leading with experts projects that then are used to help build resilience or defense in other allies. And one thing to really remember here is there's money, right? That's really important. There's will, which is really, really important in cyberspace. And then there's expertise. And there is an over 2 million job shortage in cybersecurity. That means that I heard another quote, it's for every one job that's open, we're missing 46 people. Okay, so we need to be really careful about not duplicating efforts and making sure we're using expertise where it's actually needed and where it can have the greatest amplifying effect. And that's something that's always on our back of our mind as policymakers is, are we making more work for technicians, or are we actually making their jobs easier when we're creating policies? How does NATO Cyber Command interact with US Cyber Command on security questions? Okay, so this is interesting. So there isn't, so US Cyber Command is a joint command, and it's dual-hatted with the director of Cyber Command is dual-hatted with the head of the NSA, and they basically engage in operational missions. And again, like not speaking on behalf of the US government, this is just the thing that I nerded out on at school. They engage in operational missions involving cybersecurity and cyber defense. That includes cyber protection teams that come and secure military or highly critical assets of the United States if they're under cyber attack or high threat of cyber attack. Most recently, the head of US Cyber Command did a few interviews and talked about how US Cybercom was sent into Ukraine before the war started to help defend them and threat hunt on their networks. Threat hunt, another Google word. And they essentially operationalize the United States cyber mission. They're also performing persistent engagement there. Okay, NATO Cyber Command, which, like, I'm slightly embarrassed. I might have to Google that because that's not something, the closest thing we have to that would be SIOC, our Cyber Operations Center, which is under ACO, which is under SHAPE. So Supreme Headquartered Allied Powers of Europe, coolest acronym ever. And within SHAPE, that's kind of our military side of the house of NATO. There's the ACO, which for the life of me, I'm very embarrassed I cannot remember that acronym. And within them is SIOC. And they're right now still being stood up. They're a relatively new entity. And they would interact with US Cybercom in terms of information sharing. And there's another thing called SCEPFA. I need to look at this acronym. So it's SVEPCA. So it's essentially voluntary contributions by allies. And I cannot remember what the full acronym is called. SCEPFA. Give me 1 second. SCVEPA. SCEPFA. Okay, so it's final answer. SCEPVA. And it's essentially voluntary contributions by allies to NATO missions in cyber. And so that would be a way that US Cybercom would react. It's not that they regularly react or regularly interact as much as if there is a crisis, if there's an incident, there are liaison teams within ACO and SIOC that will reach out to military counterparts to try to understand how they can help. And David, I'm fine staying on for as long as you want to have me. I'm enjoying hearing myself talk. And the cooperation is more so operational. So on the level of what expertise do we need to get working? So one thing that like US Cybercom might share is kind of organizational structure of how to manage and run and best practices of a US Cybercom or of a cyber command, right? But it's not, it's more so on the exercises best practices side. And I'm sorry if that's not super specific, but that's kind of where we are right now. Can you, and then also the military, that part of the house under SHAPE is less of my area of expertise. So there might be some interesting digging you can do about SHAPE that may lend some more specific answers. Can you tell us a little bit more about crypto and cybersecurity? I can. So I give you this because crypto, it's financial policy. And if you wake up one day and want to do financial policy, you'll make a lot of money, but will you be happy? Maybe. Good for you. Cryptocurrency is a poorly regulated form of currency, is the top line of it. I'm going to talk on the governance part instead of the technical part here. It is a way to kind of anonymously and safely send money in transactions while avoiding something called SWIFT, which is an international monetary platform that allows governments to track payments both for purposes of taxation and historical records, but also for the purposes of stopping fraud and abuse and criminal activity. One of the kind of biggest deals in the Ukraine war was that I believe Russia was kicked off of SWIFT, which is a big deal. And so when it comes to crypto and cybersecurity, that is coming from something called the blockchain, the essentially way that cryptocurrencies are spread out and decentralized. So like a bank has a bunch of money, it's in one place, it's central. Cryptocurrencies are ephemeral. They're kind of everywhere all at once. Everyone has a record of who has how much cryptocurrencies, and they're all put in the super encrypted thing called the blockchain. That's super Googleable. And by Googleable, I mean watch a YouTube video on it, because reading about it is hard. And cybersecurity comes in how that blockchain is used, how it is essentially really secure, and how it is secure and how it is able to function. When it comes to cybersecurity attacks on crypto entities, we're really looking at crypto exchanges. So where you can exchange different types of Bitcoin or different types of money for different types of cryptocurrencies. I use Bitcoin as a shorthand there. And the other thing we're somewhat looking about, I think there's maybe a case link you can make here, is the way that governments and economies are using cryptocurrencies in order to gain political power and influence. So like the digital yen is something that's really interesting, and is allowing for like sanctions avoidance, right? And North Korea has a history of hacking crypto exchanges, and then essentially using that money to fund its nuclear proliferation program. But so exchanges are kind of one of the weaker points because it's where it's not protected by blockchain. If there are more, I could talk more about crypto and cyber. I would need more specific questions there though.
Could you touch on ransomware a little bit? That's definitely been a rising challenge, especially in the United States.
Yeah. So ransomware. So ransomware is it's not a medium. So it's not about how something gets onto your system, but when it gets into your computer system, it essentially puts a bunch of files in a safe. And it says, hey, you don't get access to these files anymore. I have access to these files. If you want access to these files, you have to pay me money. It's a hostage situation. And from a technical level, the way that often looks like is someone clicks on an email they shouldn't, opens up the link they shouldn't, goes to a website they shouldn't. It then infects their computer. And if your computer is on the same system as other computers, something happens called an east-west attack. You don't have to know that, but you can if you want to. That essentially spreads the malware to other computers on the same network. And then from there, if it's really sophisticated, advanced ransomware, it will then start sending the ransomware to other people in your email contacts, or people who aren't on the same like Wi-Fi network, but that are in the same company at different locations. And it holds your files ransom. Now, old school ransomware guys kind of had like, you know, the old school like crime, like mafia codes. It's like honor among thieves kind of thing. Well, normally if you paid them money, they would then release your files and all would be hunky-dory. Two fun facts there. One, I've been told by multiple people that ransomware customer service is often better than Comcast because they really want to get your money. They really, really, really want your money. and they will teach you how to download Bitcoins. They will, because it's often done in cryptocurrency, they will teach you how to send things, and they'll give you very detailed instructions. The second fun fact about ransomware is if you are, there's an interesting quote, a statistic on this. If you pay ransomware, you are more likely to be attacked later on. Ooh, and I saw that question, is ransomware a form of AI? No, ransomware is not a form of AI. So I'll talk about that distinction in a second. So if you pay ransomware as a company, you're more likely to be attacked in ransomware again, because they know you'll pay. Again, think about it, take out the cyber, right? If I know you're going to pay a hostage fee, then I'm probably going to come back to you and like steal something and make you pay it again later. Now, there are kind of major trends happening in ransomware right now. The first is what I call fake ransomware. So if you look up what NotPetya was, it was a major cyber incident, and it pretended to be ransomware. But really what it did was it destroyed all your data. And the point of it wasn't to get money, but we are seeing a trend now where data will be destroyed even if you do pay, and even if there isn't an ulterior motive. The other thing we're seeing a trend is ransomware. You pay, and then the data, instead of being given back to you, it's released into the wild. So it's put on websites and everyone can see it. And then the last thing we're seeing is something called big game hunting, which is essentially really highly specific focused ransomware that tries to target like CEOs essentially in order to get the most amount of money. So big game hunting is more sophisticated, but whereas ransomware as a service, which is something you can buy on the dark web, is something that is more of a blunt instrument, right? Opposed to big game hunting is more of a scalpel. And then is ransomware an AI? No. So artificial intelligence is really the idea, is the ability, and this is emerging technology. It's different than cybersecurity, but it is software that is able to learn and replicate. And so by taking big sets of data, and it's able to do that kind of almost instantaneously. As the data changes, it can adapt. Many cyber defenses and cyber attackers are using AI to get better, right? So if you have AI running alongside ransomware, it may be able to avoid antivirus software, but ransomware is not AI. Ransomware is a form of malware, and it can be a bunch of different forms of malware that locks up your data. AI is a way, AI is a practice of augmenting machines and human thinking to make them respond quickly to stimuli and input. So in this case, AI could be an enabler to ransomware, but even then on a technical level, it's not AI that's necessarily driving that kind of political governance level ransomware issue. Okay, cool. Are there any international cybercrime laws? So there was the Budapest Convention that was signed. It doesn't really do a lot, Googleable term. And there is, just like in general, international law, which was interpreted in terms of cyberspace in the Tallinn Manual and the Tallinn Manual 2, I believe. There is also the International Cyber Group of Working Experts, which was under the UN. And then there was also the Open Ending Working Group, also under the UN. So these are kind of, when we're talking about international governance terms, these are the people we're thinking of. But there are not really international cybercrime laws outside of general outside of general crime laws, right? So it's people, like, essentially what like Interpol will do, for instance, or Europol, is take financial laws that could be broken, or general like international like criminal standards that would be broken, and then put cyber on top of them, but like our closest structures for like international cyber in general law are going to be the ones that I just mentioned. If there is an attack on NATO, which legal system judges it? Okay, so again, two distinctions here, right? There's NATO as in like the headquarters that I'm sitting in, and then there's NATO that is the alliance comprised of 30 allies. If there is an attack on NATO, on the 30 allies, essentially one ally would try to invoke Article 5. The first time Article 5 was invoked was actually right after 9/11. And they get into a formation called the North Atlantic Council, a NAC meeting, where they all vote on whether or not Article 5 should be invoked. If Article 5 is then invoked, it means the alliance can use their full military power and might to respond to the threat as they see adequate and fit. So it's not really someone else judging it. If it's like NATO headquarters is attacked, which is in Belgium, a member of NATO, that might lead to an Article 5 invocation, but not necessarily. And so there isn't really a legal system to judge it, like what is and is not a cyber attack. Like the closest thing would be the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. Oh, we're going to pretend that I knew that. And that would essentially be able to like make a claim that a state was attacked. The problem with that kind of court structure is, again, states don't want to share their homework because it reveals how sophisticated their cybersecurity is or isn't. And then also only countries can come to that forum. And often there's an issue where private entities are attacked, which we haven't even talked about the private sector yet, but that's also a big issue. So no legal system really judges it, / potentially individual allied court systems could judge it. But again, it's not really, if it's an attack at NATO, we're thinking more of that governance level, which is kind of outside of that legal system. How can we confirm who does an attack? How traceable are cyber attacks? Cool. So this is when it comes to attribution. There are 3 layers of attribution. There's the who's the person hands on keyboard, who's the person shouting orders, and then who is the bigger, broader entity backing them up. And so we often don't necessarily care if Amanda is hacking into something unless, you know, which I wouldn't do because security clearances. Sometimes we care about who's giving the direct order. So that would be our advanced persistent threat groups, right? But really we care about who is funding those advanced persistent threat groups, our APTs, Googleable. And for instance, like NotPetya was done by Sandworm. Sandworm is funded by Russia. We care about that Russian attribution. There are really advanced tools in order to track kind of signatures. Like you've seen those movies where like forgers, like, oh, this person always feathers their F with a little floral, right? Hackers have those too. And essentially we have the intelligence to trace and look at that. And also the political context. Again, there's a war in Ukraine. Ukraine got hacked in the middle of the war, and it happened to help a certain entity in the war. I wonder who it was. But there is a common misconception that we can't confirm or trace hacks. We can. What are the international cybercriminal laws? Mention that, and who is responsible to give out the punishment? There really isn't. I kind of answered that already. It's really states like if there is a violation of international law, sometimes the UN will deal out sanctions and or individual states will deal out sanctions unilaterally, bilaterally, or multilaterally, but there isn't really an automatic international mechanism, and that's kind of similar in other areas as well. What's the name of Daniel Black's article? Dan Black, my love. The case of the missing cyber war. It's in foreign affairs. How high of a priority is internet protection to NATO? So NATO as an HQ, like we use internet. We also have, you know, our own dedicated teams to protecting our internet. If we mean like the protection of like the undersea cables and lines of communication, I recently, 1 second, I can just tell you right now if it's unclassed. I think it is. Yes. Oh wait, but Is it distributed? Something we're thinking about. If there is something I can distribute to you on that, I will. But looking at kind of the distribution of internet is something that NATO as like an alliance is thinking of, and it's also involves in our cyber defense pledge, and that goes back to building resilience. Okay. From Noah, if NATO is hit with a cyber attack, what are the key elements that enable NATO to keep operating? Awesome. So what you're talking about is a COOP plan, continuity of operations plan, or continuity of operations and mission assurance, if we're talking more government and military. Great question, Noah. So also a question that I can't answer for security reasons. So I'll generally, there are kind of several ways that any organization can build resilience that enable them to keep operating during a cyber attack. The first is having backups at a separate location that are kind of segmented away from the network. That's really hard because you have to update backups, which means that like if you have a virus in your computer, you're updating your backups with the virus in them, and then the virus is on a delay and kind of springs up. But having backups is really important, and making sure the backups are clean, safe, and up to date. Another is essentially having like an operational organizational plan of how to respond. So that's something the military is really, really, really good at. And you can read about it kind of just from the US perspective. And I imagine it would be very similar from the kind of like NATO command structure perspective, where like the military has backups in using radio communications, in, like actually physically like running around or driving around or planing around to get information. And so it's really about having low key, like kind of backup plans. And the last thing is about really being specific about what you're protecting, right? So like, no matter what, I can operate with radio. As long as I can secure my radio, that means that I am able to do my job and function. So it's really about figuring out what the critical systems are and protecting them, which military is really uniquely good at doing. So key elements I would say are we have exercises that prepare us should that happen. And we practice that. We think and plan ahead of how to be resilient and get back online quickly, which means because we have like teams that can respond to that. And we are thinking about plan Bs, plan Cs, plan Ds. Are there specific risks for using cryptocurrency other than just personally losing money? Personally losing money, there are some now like financial issues, like it keeps, the US federal government can't decide who's regulating cryptocurrency, like which specific like entity under the Department of Treasury is regulating it. And so the issue you're really going to run into is like, are you reporting it on your taxes right? Could you financially get in trouble? If it's just you specifically, that isn't a big risk. When it comes on like a broader governance international scale, it's really the inability to track money, to track and control money. And that leads to a proliferation of criminal activity that can also fund, bad stuff like North Korea's nuclear proliferation program. And then when it comes to the United States, it makes the dollar lose power, right? So right now, like the world economy is essentially pegged to the US dollar. One thing that the digital yen is trying to do is through the Belt and Road Initiative, basically have people pay them back in yen or digital yen. That would then mean more economies are based off of, revolve around on, and using the yen, which then would peg more money to that currency. So it's kind of like what we call it, we would think of it like a hybrid method of conflict or warfare in order to like undermine kind of like US supremacy. In terms of Article 5, when the rest of NATO responds, would they be able to counterattack in an offensive way, or would that be a war crime? Good question, Evelyn, and it reminds me, great question to wrap up on, and something I want to say. So one good thing to do is look at the past NATO summits, and you could see the most recent strategic concept in this one. So I would say starting in 2016, which is I think the year that NATO recognized cyberspace as a military operational domain. And when we first did that, we said a cyber attack could trigger Article More recently, we have updated that, which my office did, which is really proud of them, to say a campaign, cumulative effects of cyber attacks could trigger Article 5. And I think this is going to be a really nuanced form of the debate that's really important, is what exactly are we talking about when we think of campaigns and triggering Article 5. They, under international law from, again, my non-lawyer reading of it, is you do have a right to respond to an attack. You do have a right to self-defense, which means, and in theory, preemptive self-defense, which means that NATO would be able to counterattack. And again, we have DimeFill, our whole tool to respond. And so we could respond in theory with a cyber attack, or we could respond with other types of kinetic means or sanctions and so on and so forth. In order for NATO, the entity where I'm sitting, to respond, which would actually be SHAPE, they would need to invoke Article 5. For a specific ally to respond, that's kind of a different story. And that would be kind of up to the individual ally. And that is my soapbox. It is 45. I think I did it.
Yes, Amanda. Well, first of all, can we get a huge round of applause if you can unmute your computers?
I'm glad you all found that helpful. I haven't gotten to talk that fast in a while, too. Thanks for letting me get that out.
So as you can imagine, Dave is wearing about 11 different hats this week during camp, and he got called away for a second. I think he's making sure that 150 hungry students get to eat in about 10 minutes. But he asked me to leave off with a couple of things. First of all, just a huge thank you for all of your time. This was wonderfully informative. I think for students at every level, there's a lot that we learned about, especially some of the key concepts when you're talking about resilience and the relationships between the NATO partners and the relationship between NATO and the other institutions. So I think you just kind of opened both a number of doors for how we can think about cybersecurity in debate, and also many cans of worms that me and the rest of the lab leaders are going to be trying to answer for a couple of days. But just want to say thanks. We really appreciate your time. This was extremely informative, and you gave us a lot of really good ideas for what the key issues in cybersecurity are, and how to think about NATO's relationship with the US and NATO, and how NATO views the rest of the world in terms of ensuring our cybersecurity. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to probably seeing some debates when I'm back in DC in the fall. And if any specific questions come up in general, but also specifically to the lab leaders, I'm happy to answer emails or help when and where I can. So I hope you all have a good rest of your camp.